Runa is our keynote speaker in the Atlas Symposium today, and her appearance here in Edmonton is sponsored by the Sustainability Council and by Community Housing Canada. So I think that's enough from me. We're all here to hear Runa, so I will hand over and let Runa speak to us about her great research. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Damien. It's a very nice introduction. As Damien mentioned, I'm at Royal Roads University, which is in Victoria, BC, and we're based on the lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees peoples, and I'm fortunate to be able to work on those lands. So the font has changed a little bit. It seems like it's not as modern as the font that I chose, but hopefully it all works out. So today I'm going to be talking about Canada's households and the zero carbon energy transition. And in the introduction to this lecture today in the program, I mentioned that a lot of the times when we're thinking about transition, we often think about the supply side of things and how is the supply side of things going to change. But we do definitely need to be thinking about the downstream effects of that and how this is going to impact the public and everyday households. So that's where my work is situated. So the big challenge broadly and overall in which this work is situated is net zero. And net zero, what is this? This means that to achieve net zero emissions, our economy either emits no greenhouse gas emissions or offsets its emissions, which means taking out as many emissions as we put in. So this requires shifting to technologies and energy systems that do not produce GHG emissions while removing remaining emissions from the atmosphere and storing them permanently. So some of the actions associated with transition include adopting electric heat pumps or electric vehicles, using energy efficient technology, moving towards power generation that's non-emitting, and carbon capture and storage. So on the left-hand side, I've got regulations, legislation, policies that are pushing our country towards net zero. And these things are making us, we're trying to address climate change. And to do that, there's a transition that's happening. And this energy transition means that we are going to be transforming the energy system. So everything from production to end use. And this will have downstream impacts. And this makes me wonder about the equity aspect of these impacts, the burdens and the costs associated with transition. How is that going to be distributed? And that will help us address whether or not this will be a sustainable transition. So Canada has joined over 120 countries in committing to be net zero by 2050, including all other G7 countries. Some provinces and cities have also made net zero commitments, including Vancouver, Toronto, Quebec, Halifax, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Quebec. So there's a lot of action going on in this space. Oh yeah, this doesn't work. So today I want to quickly talk about my overall program of research and some of the things my research group is doing. Then I will talk about two projects. The first being on energy poverty and the energy transition. And the second is looking at the role of trust in actors in energy transitions policy. So these projects are at different phases in their life cycle right now. And I'll mention a little bit more about that as we keep going. So this is my lab group. It's a fun name. I'm happy that I get to use this acronym. So we're the Beer Lab. And I've got some wonderful people and students that I get to work with. And some of the things we're looking at is energy affordability and how to measure energy affordability, the building performance of community housing, which is part of the larger project that Damien is leading, building retrofitting, charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, Alberta's oil workers and the energy transition, stakeholder decision-making in the community housing sector, just energy transition in the community housing sector. And most recently, we're looking at national surveys and their assessment of energy-related content. So this is very much interdisciplinary energy research. A lot of these things are interconnected with each other, but they're also connected to the transition, to households, and the larger public. So the first project I'm going to be talking about and paper is addressing energy poverty and inequity in electricity decarbonization in Canada. We've got a pretty large team that's been working on this. This builds on my previous energy poverty research, or I should say the larger team's previous energy poverty research. And with this work, the specific policy context are the clean electricity regulations. So what's the challenge? Well, the challenge is affordable and clean electricity. So limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius and decarbonizing global energy systems requires massive changes. And the electricity sector is going to play a key role. So power generation globally is the biggest contributor to carbon dioxide emissions. So a critical step is to decarbonize the grid and our power systems. In Canada, fortunately, 84% approximately of Canada's electricity comes from renewable and non-emitting sources. That being said, it's the fourth largest source of emissions in the country. So aligning electricity systems with net zero requires significant expansion of transmission, distribution, generation. Federal programming will likely play a key role in this, but investment in the infrastructures will also likely come from other types of governments, as well as private investment, and also likely from the rate base, which therefore intersects with this question of affordability. So changes to the electricity system will likely affect electricity bills. There will likely be increases in electricity demand as well, and also the adoption of end-use technologies that are compatible with the electricity system. So a quick, we just got cut off a little bit, but it says, reads primary heating systems by province in 2021. And this is data from Statistics Canada. And so I just wanted to quickly show you where we are and where we're going or where we're hoping to go. And the bar with these bars here, those are the heat pump adoption levels right now. And then we've got electric baseboards just on top of that. And we can look at Alberta. And this is where we are for heat pump adoption and what we've got for baseboards. So we've got a really long way to go. And that's not just in Alberta, that's across the country. So this is something to think about as we are transitioning. Where are we and where do we need to go? And what are the impacts of that movement going to be on end users? So for this study, we did an analysis of population data, Statistics Canada 2019 survey of household spending. It includes 17,491 households in the 10 provinces, as well as 937 households in the 3 territorial capitals. And some of the key variables that we looked at include electricity spending, natural gas spending, other fuel spending, and this is all spending for a primary residence. So if someone has a secondary residence, that's not being counted here. We looked at total current consumption, total expenditures, which includes total current consumption, as well as total household income. And just as a FYI, total current consumption is a sum of current expenditures for food, shelter, household operations, household furnishings, et cetera, et cetera. So for this study, we had several different measures and calculations. We looked at mean and median energy spending. We looked at mean and median electricity spending, focusing particularly on electricity because we're looking at the transition to an electricity system or an electric system. We looked at the ratio of spending. So proportionally, what does spending look like for electricity over all energy expenditures? And we also looked at, I'm just noticing I don't have here, but energy expenditures out of total expenditures. We looked at energy poverty using 2 different indicators. One is called the 10% indicator, and the second one's called the twice the median indicator. And I should probably just explain those right now. So the 10% indicator, when a household is spending more than 10% of its income on energy services, that's when they would qualify as being or facing energy poverty, according to that indicator. And then the twice the median indicator, what we do there is we look at what median spending is, and then double that. And then anyone or households that exceed that, they are then qualifying as facing energy poverty, according to that indicator. And then we looked at, or we used angle curves. So we look at the budget share of spending on energy services as a function of household income. And I will show you figures and the graphs that go along with this. So something I quickly want to mention as a limitation. So this data excludes renters who do not report paying bills for energy services if their utility bills are included in their rent. Or this data could be partially reported if renters are only paying one utility bill, typically heating. Therefore, the burdens of renter populations can be difficult to capture. So in 2019, Canada's provinces, the median spending on electricity was $1,128. On energy, it was more, closer to about $1,900. Median electricity expenditures were generally highest in the Atlantic provinces. For example, in New Brunswick, median spending on electricity was $2,304. So you can compare that with the national average. It was lowest in British Columbia, where I am. So it was at $812 there. In the territorial capitals, median spending was $1,402, and it was the highest in Yellowknife, where it was about $2,000. When looking at just energy expenditures and not just electricity, we see similar patterns as well. And that spending is highest in the Atlantic provinces. Sorry, this is a bit hard to read, trying to cram a lot of provinces and territorial capitals all in one slide.
Why is Iqaluit so cheap?
Sorry?
Why is Iqaluit so cheap?
Iqaluit.
None of them.
There's a lot of
It's incredibly expensive.
there's a lot of subsidization that is happening. That's a good question. And then we also looked at this by income quintiles, and you'll notice that the lower income quintiles, first and second, notably in both the provinces and the territorial capitals, are spending less on electricity and energy. And quite a bit, if you look at the fifth quintile and even the fourth quintile. We also looked at spending by quintile, by province and territorial capitals. Sorry, some of that is getting cut off because of the font change. And so what we're noticing here is that there are differences between provinces as well as within provinces. So for example, all income quintiles in Newfoundland and Labrador and New Brunswick are spending more than any other quintile in some of the other provinces. The first quintile in Newfoundland and Labrador and Prince Edward Island is spending more than the fifth quintile in Ontario, British Columbia, and equivalently to Alberta's fifth income quintile. There's also considerable spread within provinces, such as in New Brunswick and in the territorial capitals, where the range between the first and the fifth income quintiles are substantially spread out. So you'll see more of a spread here versus with some of the other jurisdictions where it's closer together, the spending. And there are lots of factors that go into this, and we'll get into that in a little bit. As I promised, lots of figures and graphs. Next, looking at the ratio of electricity spending to energy spending, as well as energy to total spending. So what we did is we looked at all of these jurisdictions. We looked at proportionally how much are they spending on electricity compared to their energy spending or energy spending to their total. And then we took the average in that jurisdiction. Across the provinces, on average, 72% of a household's energy expenditures came from electricity. Now, this is the average. This varies, as you can see, by province or territorial capital. In the territorial capitals, that's a little different. The average is about 58%. Energy spending makes up a larger share of the total spending in the Atlantic provinces. And that's something to keep in the back of your head as well. We can look at this also by income quintile. And those ratio spending it's higher again for the lower income or bottom income quintiles compared to the top. So higher proportional spending. When we look at burdens, so that 10% or twice the median, we noticed that for those who are experiencing these types of burdens, and we looked at electricity burdens as well as energy burdens. They range from 1.44 to about almost, 2.5. And so this is how much more the burden is of spending for those experiencing energy poverty. Now, energy poverty here, the proxy measure is the burden. Just so you have that awareness, because energy poverty can be a multidimensional phenomenon. And so burdens can be just one aspect of how can we look at energy poverty. What contributes to energy poverty? Well, in previous research that I've done and that some of my colleagues have done and lots of people have done in other countries, there's lots of things that go into what determines energy poverty. So it can be income. So here's not just income that's determining whether or not someone's in energy poverty. It's their dwelling, whether or not that's energy efficient or not. It's also how much are they paying for energy? And that could vary across jurisdictions and geography. So there's more things, determining factors that go into figuring out a burden. And this is our angle curves where we looked at the budget share as a function of income. So on the y-axis, we've got our budget share. How much are people spending on electricity or energy out of their total spending? And how does that vary with household income? So on the top left, on the top right, those are the people that are experiencing energy poverty according to the 10% indicator. And those on the bottom are not. And what we're seeing is that with more disposable income, there is more spending going to electricity and energy services. Whereas with those that are not in energy poverty, according to this indicator, that is not happening. It's more stable, which leads us to think that there are people in the energy system that are being deprived of energy services, that they are not able to use the energy or the amount of energy that they need to, given that when they do encounter, available income or disposable income, they are spending it on electricity and energy. I didn't present, or I'm not presenting the angle curves for the twice the median, but it is somewhat similar. So what are some key findings? Well, higher income households are spending more on electricity and energy services. That's not blow you out of the water kind of a finding, but it is when we think about lower income households spending more as a proportion of their overall total budget. Bottom to mid-range quintiles are spending more on electricity compared to other fuels. So they might be particularly vulnerable if the prices of electricity go up. The budget share analysis shows that people are struggling in the current energy system. So people are vulnerable if there's going to be increases with using more electricity or needing to use more electricity. And then if those go up, if the rates go up as well. Oh, so I want to mention, sorry, I have my notes here so I wouldn't forget this. I just can't get the mouse to work. Sorry. Oh, thank you. So these findings don't take into account cost savings, or not these findings, I should say the impact of these findings don't take into account cost savings that will occur due to energy efficiency improvements or income increases. Although I'm not as sure about incomes going up anytime soon, but still it doesn't take that into account just because we haven't been really seeing that a whole lot. I think it's okay to say that. And as electricity expenditures increase, expenditures on fossil fuels will decrease. So there could be some balancing. So that's important to keep in mind as well. In Atlantic Canada, There is greater variety, in the energy sources that are being used. Sorry, can you help me out just a second? I just want to bring that down. Okay, that's great, thanks. So in Atlantic Canada, there's greater variety in energy sources that are being used for heating. So they heat a lot more with oil and wood, which contrasts a lot with the rest of Canada. So space and water heating costs for older built homes using heating oil can almost be 3 to 4 times more than not using those fuels. So that's one of the reasons why costs are, or bills, or people are spending more out there, and what makes them particularly challenged. Single detached homes also are harder on the energy budget, and there's a lot more single detached homes out in the Atlantic provinces as well. With respect to spending on electricity, we note it's higher in provinces where electricity is used for both heat and power, and where hydroelectricity is dominant in the energy mix, such as in Quebec and British Columbia and Manitoba. And this contrasts with other jurisdictions and provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, where there's a lot of natural gas, fossil fuels for heating. So we have all sorts of different types of vulnerabilities. Provinces, jurisdictions that are fossil fuel based, they are also going to experience potential challenges when transitioning from those fossil fuels to electricity and those infrastructure upgrades, where are those costs going to be allocated? So these are things to think about, because they will probably have downstream effects on end users. The territories are also a clear example where the energy transition will be difficult. Communities here are very isolated, dispersed over immersed landmass, and a lot of them are off-grid and not connected to a main grid. So again, here, very challenging position to be in when making that energy transition. So some policy recommendations, or some recommendations that align with policy areas. And I won't get into this in too much detail because I have another project that I quickly want to talk about. But we do need some kind of energy poverty strategy. We are behind compared to other countries who have strategies that have indicators and measures, and it can be difficult to tackle something if you don't know what you're looking at or what you're measuring. So using an energy justice approach for something like a national energy poverty strategy is highly recommended. And with this kind of strategizing, really encouraging a multi-stakeholder engagement process so that it is participatory, that households, the public, end users get to be a part of this process so that it's not top down. We need more end use data, energy data. We are lacking, and it's very difficult to know where we are with respect to end use and where we need to go in terms of how much do people need to use and who's having difficulties and that kind of thing. I was presenting on spending but not using, and that data is really hard to get access to. With making things affordable, there won't be one thing that will be the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet here. We need a suite of actions and measures, policies. And so several things, such as a lifeline rate, on-bill credits, seasonal programs, emergency assistance, different kinds of rate design for bills. So all of these things together can help tackle affordability issues, and also assist people in that move to transition. Some other recommendations around clean energy and electricity is to eliminate non-payment of disconnections for vulnerable households, to secure and facilitate tenant rights under extreme weather events. There's a lot of folks that are renters that live in buildings that don't have cooling or access to cooling in the summer, and this is becoming more and more of a problem. And so we need to figure this out. And then decarbonizing efficiency for the residential sector. We really, really need to be thinking about energy efficiency. A lot of our stock is very old, needs upgrading, and we need to be looking at how to get these buildings retrofitted and with energy efficiency measures in them. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second project now. And it got cut off there, but the title here is Trust in Environmental Organizations. Trust in Scientists and Environmental Organizations is associated with energy policy support for transition. So policy support is important in the energy transition for many reasons. Public opinion is a critical determinant of policy change. Policy change or policy support, can enable behaviors such as adopting renewable energy sources, adopting energy efficient technology, investing in building energy efficiency, and changing energy use behaviors. So lack of policy support has been associated with as a barrier to a renewable energy transition. Research points to several factors that explain policy support, and these include social, psychological, demographic types of factors. Trust in certain groups of people is also one of those factors. So research indicates that trust in relevant actors can make a difference in policy support. For example, in Sweden, the public's trust in government and with politicians is associated with greater support for a carbon tax. In the United States, trust in scientists and environmental organizations is associated with greater climate policy support. Trust also plays an important role across cultures and countries. And trust is also really critical in discussions of costs and benefits, which are important when we're thinking about energy system transformation and climate change. So with these increasing questions around equity, this idea of trust seems to be really, really important. Trust can be distinguished into, as I mentioned, having trust for certain stakeholders or actors, policy actors like government, politicians, scientists, energy companies, industry, non-governmental groups, lots of different people. The public might not have the relevant experience or expertise to know how to navigate this energy transition. And so that's why, again, this idea of trust can be very critical. So we conducted a survey in Ontario, working with a research company, and we administered the survey to 1,620 people in Ontario, and this was a representative sample, represented Ontario. The key variables that we looked at were policy support and trust in various actors. And then we conducted some quantitative regression analysis to see what predicts trust for certain energy policies using certain actors or trust in certain actors as one of the determining determinants. We also surveyed on demographics and dwelling characteristics because research shows that these are linked to policy support as well. So we asked people, how much do you support or oppose on a scale of 1 to 100? Several different policies. We asked about 15 different policies, and I'll show them in a slide momentarily. But they can be grouped or categorized as belonging to these categories here. So looking at connecting remote off-grid communities to the grid, renewable contracts, we asked about electric vehicles, we asked about energy efficiency retrofit programs, different energy sources for generation and preferences therein, electrification, fuel switching for space heating. Ontario is very much using natural gas, so we asked them whether or not they have preferences for switching or do they support or oppose switching. We asked them about the hydrogen economy and more of that integration into the economy and about community energy plans. These are the different types of actors that we asked people about. We asked them about their general trust in these actors. So we asked, in assessing the actions associated with energy transitions, please indicate your level of trust in each of the following. And then we also asked about whether or not people thought that these actors were competent and whether or not we thought they had integrity. So in the research, researchers have broken down trust into these separate categories as well, or that trust contains these different dimensions. So these are the results for, as a main effect, looking at policy and the support of these policies. So in Ontario, there's more support for carrots rather than sticks. I guess that's not very surprising, but also households are demonstrating support for policies that will directly benefit them. The most popular, and I was very surprised actually, is the development of renewable natural gas, such as capturing landfill waste to generate energy. That was the #1 policy that was supported, followed by support for interest-free energy efficiency loan programs for homeowners and landlords. And the third was dedicated funding for low-income energy efficiency retrofit programs. I was surprised, given all these different types of policies that we asked about. The support for RNG could be, we're thinking, could be a symptom of wanting to be environmental. And because Ontarians are likely challenged by the decarbonization of space heating, given the embeddedness of natural gas in their energy system infrastructure, as well as the incumbent actors that deliver energy services in Ontario and heating. So renewable natural gas might be a transition fuel. It might be considered a transition fuel for these households, or a bridge fuel. Or as we're calling it, a bridge fuel, because natural gas has been termed a bridge fuel. Ontarians are also supporting policies that address home energy efficiency. So research shows that retrofit schemes really impact domestic energy use and can benefit electricity bills or energy bills. there are some programs, federal programs, that won't be continuing in the future, the Greener Homes Initiative, for example, and likely that won't be landing well with the public. So this is something that people that are delivering programs, government needs to be thinking about. There is desire and want for retrofit and energy efficiency programs. And something that's very notable is that we have a representative sample. So we have covered incomes across or households across the income distribution. So all of these groups of people are saying that they want these kinds of programs. And they're also saying they wanted dedicated funding for low-income energy efficiency programs. I think this is speaking to an idea that there's a lack of equity in the retrofit programs that are currently being delivered. Also, Ontarians are demonstrating support for low carbon pathways by supporting renewables and hydrogen, but not necessarily the continued development of Alberta's oil and gas sector. So where did that come in? That was second last. So in Alberta, should probably mention that. So I don't have much time. I have just a minute, I suppose. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay. We also looked at trust, and overall, there's lukewarm trusts, levels of trust for most actors. But overwhelmingly, there is support for scientists and researchers, as well as for nonprofit organizations. General trust, as well as competency, integrity, and value similarity. So we kind of saw that across the board. And then what we next did is we looked at, we focused in on 5 policies having to do with energy sources, because we're interested in that in the transition. And we looked at trust in actors predicting the policy support. And the results varied by policy. But what we did notice, and since I have just a minute left, what we did notice was that for some of the emerging types of energy sources, such as renewable natural gas and hydrogen, more trust in scientists and researchers and nonprofits were associated with more policy support for these emerging types of policy pathways. So what do we need to do? Public support is necessary, especially for long-term thinking and energy transition. So an all hands on deck kind of situation is likely the ideal situation where we're collaborating more. And anticipating public responses will assist with the formulation of policies, design, and implementation, all of these things. What we are seeing is that most trusted are scientists and researchers, and as well nonprofits. So in this transition, we should be leveraging this trust. And government who might not be working, working on the ground with people and communities should be leveraging this level of trust in scientists and researchers and nonprofits that the public appears to want. And that's it. So thank you so much.